June 6, 1944. Lieutenant Commander James Reynolds stood on the deck of HMCS Prince David, his binoculars trained on the misty horizon where the French coast should be emerging. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of knowledge. In his mind, he replayed the intelligence briefings, the maps showing the Atlantic Wall's defenses, the statistics that haunted every officer's nightmares. Behind him, packed below decks, 14,000 Canadian soldiers waited in the darkness, many vomiting from seasickness, others writing what they believed would be their final letters home. The German commanders manning the Atlantic Wall had no idea, not a whisper of intelligence. Not a single reconnaissance report had reached them about the armada now churning through the Channel's black waters. This invisibility, this technological and psychological sleight of hand, represented years of innovation, deception, and human ingenuity that would crack open Hitler's fortress Europe. But the real story isn't just about the battle. It's about how flawed technology, human doubt, and cultural understanding converged to create one of history's most audacious military operations. In the years leading up to this moment, Allied losses in amphibious operations had been catastrophic. Dieppe, 1942, had seen 60% Canadian casualties in just 9 hours. The psychological scars ran deep through Canadian military culture. How do you convince men to storm a fortified beach when their brothers, fathers, and friends had been slaughtered doing the exact same thing 2 years earlier? The answer lay not in perfecting the weapons, but in understanding the human mind, in cultural bonds, and in embracing technological imperfection as a strategic advantage. What if I told you that the very flaws in Allied planning, the mistakes in intelligence gathering, and the cultural misunderstandings between German and Allied forces would become the unexpected keys to victory? This is the story of how 14,000 Canadians became invisible to one of history's most sophisticated defensive systems, and how that invisibility was built not just on radar and deception, but on deep psychological and cultural warfare that exploited every human weakness in the Nazi command structure. The Atlantic Wall, stretching over 1,600 miles, represented Hitler's paranoid masterpiece. German casualties on the Eastern Front were mounting horrifically, with over 4 million dead by early 1944. Hitler needed the West secured, needed to believe his fortress Europe was impenetrable. But fortress mentality breeds its own weaknesses, and the Allies were counting on it. The roots of Juno Beach's success trace back to the darkest days of the 1930s, when the Nazi war machine was still taking shape, and the world watched with growing dread. In 1933, Adolf Hitler's rise to power transformed Germany from a defeated nation into an industrial juggernaut hell-bent on revenge. The Treaty of Versailles had humiliated Germany, stripped it of territory, crushed its economy with reparations, and left millions unemployed and hungry. Hitler exploited this cultural trauma brilliantly, weaving a narrative of restoration and vengeance that resonated deep in the German psyche. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, understood something fundamental about human psychology that the Allies would later exploit in reverse. People believe what confirms their existing fears and hopes. By 1936, Hitler's reoccupation of the Rhineland proved the Western powers wouldn't fight, psychologically emboldening the Nazi regime. The Anschluss with Austria in 1938, the annexation of the Sudetenland, each success reinforced Hitler's belief in his own invincibility and Western weakness. But across the Channel, a different kind of preparation was underway. British intelligence officers, many of them academics and eccentrics who understood human nature better than military doctrine, were studying not just German military capabilities, but German cultural psychology. Among them was a young Canadian liaison officer named John David Keast, born in Toronto in 1912 to a family of Great War veterans. Keast had studied psychology at the University of Toronto before joining the Canadian Military Intelligence Service in 1939. His father had served at Vimy Ridge, and the stories of that battle, where Canadians had achieved what British and French forces could not, had instilled in young Keast a belief in Canadian military capability mixed with profound respect for the costs of war. Keast's early reports from London in 1940 highlighted a troubling pattern. German intelligence gathering was exceptional at tactical levels. Their Enigma-encrypted communications allowed for rapid coordination. Their military doctrine emphasized speed and overwhelming force. But culturally, the Nazi command structure had a fatal flaw rooted in Hitler's leadership style. The Führer demanded absolute loyalty, which meant subordinates rarely challenged his assumptions. This created what modern psychologists would call confirmation bias at an institutional level. If Hitler believed the main Allied invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the entire intelligence apparatus would interpret data to support that belief. Keast's insight was profound, but initially dismissed by traditional military minds. He argued in a 1941 memo that defeating Germany required not just better weapons, but better understanding of German cultural psychology, their command rigidity, their belief in Aryan superiority, which made them underestimate Allied, especially Commonwealth, forces. His commanding officer wrote in the margin, "Interesting speculation, but wars are won with steel, not psychology." That commanding officer would be dead within a year, killed during a raid on Dieppe. The Dieppe raid of August 19, 1942, became the crucible that would forge the Juno Beach strategy. 5,000 Canadian troops, mostly from the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, launched an assault on the heavily defended French port. The operation was based on traditional military thinking. Hit them hard, hit them fast, establish a beachhead. What followed was carnage. Of the 4,963 Canadians who sailed, 3,367 were killed, wounded, or captured. 68% casualties in 9 hours. The psychological impact on Canadian forces cannot be overstated. Soldiers who survived returned home with survivor's guilt so profound that many couldn't speak of it for decades. The cultural trauma rippled through Canadian society. Newspapers published endless casualty lists, families mourned, and a fundamental question emerged within military planning circles. How do you ask men to do this again? The answer came from an unlikely source. A young signals officer named Margaret Brooke, one of the few women working in operational planning, suggested during a briefing that perhaps the problem wasn't the soldiers' courage, but the commander's assumptions. She pointed out that Dieppe had been launched in broad daylight after minimal deception efforts. The Germans knew they were coming. She asked a simple question that changed everything. What if instead of trying to overcome German defenses with force, we convince them we're not coming at all? Or better yet, convince them we're coming somewhere else? This wasn't just about military deception. It was about understanding that the German command suffered from what we now call the sunk cost fallacy and confirmation bias. They had invested heavily in fortifying Pas-de-Calais because it was the shortest crossing point. They believed, culturally, that the Allies would take the most direct route because efficiency was valued in German military doctrine. The Allies would exploit this by feeding German intelligence exactly what they expected to see while hiding the real invasion force through a combination of technological innovation and cultural manipulation. By 1943, the concept of Operation Overlord was taking shape, and within it, the specific Canadian objective, Juno Beach. But the planners faced enormous challenges. The Atlantic Wall was growing stronger daily. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, appointed to strengthen coastal defenses in late 1943, was adding millions of mines, concrete bunkers, underwater obstacles, and artillery positions. Intelligence reports suggested Rommel was placing one mine every yard along some beach sections. The psychological warfare aspect was equally daunting. How do you maintain operational security among 14,000 soldiers while simultaneously conducting the greatest deception operation in history? The solution came from understanding cultural bonds. Canadians, having suffered at Dieppe, had a unique motivation that transcended normal military discipline. Revenge, yes, but also redemption, proving that Dieppe wasn't their failure but a failure of planning. This cultural psychology would be harnessed. Soldiers were told repeatedly that this time would be different. This time they had learned from mistakes. This time they wouldn't be sacrificed due to poor intelligence or inadequate support. The technology being developed to support them reflected this human-centered approach. The Hobart's Funnies, specialized armored vehicles designed by British Major General Percy Hobart, included swimming tanks, flail tanks to clear mines, and flame-throwing tanks. But these weren't just weapons. They were psychological tools designed to give soldiers confidence. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Shull, who would later become a naval historian, wrote in his diary in early 1944 about watching Canadian tank crews train with the new DD swimming tanks. These tanks, equipped with flotation screens, could theoretically swim ashore ahead of infantry. Shull noted that the first time crews saw these contraptions, they laughed. It looked absurd. A 30-ton tank with a canvas skirt floating on water. But after successful trials, he observed something remarkable. Soldiers' demeanor changed. They began to believe the brass actually cared about getting them ashore alive. This wasn't invincibility. It was hope rooted in tangible innovation. The cultural dimension of preparation extended to French resistance coordination. SOE agents, many of them French-Canadian, worked to establish communication networks with Norman resistance cells. These agents understood something German intelligence missed. The cultural bonds between French Canadians and Norman French created communication channels. The Germans, with their rigid hierarchy and distrust of occupied populations, couldn't penetrate. Messages about German troop movements, beach defenses, and local geography flowed from Norman farmers to the resistance to Canadian planners. This grassroots intelligence gathering, based on cultural trust rather than technological superiority, proved invaluable. The challenges facing the Juno Beach planners by early 1944 were staggering, each one a potential catastrophe that could turn the invasion into another Dieppe. The first major obstacle was technological and almost comically imperfect. The DD tanks, those swimming tanks that had inspired such hope, were fatally flawed. During trials in rough seas off the Scottish coast in March 1944, 5 tanks sank immediately, drowning their crews. The canvas flotation screens collapsed under wave pressure. Engineers scrambled to redesign, but time was running out. Lieutenant Bill McCormick, a tank commander from Regina, wrote to his sister after the failed trials expressing a sentiment many shared. He said, "They're sending us across the channel in bathtubs with guns and hoping the Germans are too busy laughing to shoot." This wasn't just mechanical failure, it was psychological warfare against Allied morale. Every failed test reinforced the trauma of Dieppe, reminded soldiers that high command might once again be sending them to die due to inadequate equipment. The pressure on engineers and planners was immense. Another critical challenge was weather forecasting, a technology so imperfect it was barely better than guesswork. Allied meteorologists, led by Group Captain James Stagg of the RAF, faced an impossible task. They needed to predict channel weather days in advance when their models could barely predict weather hours ahead accurately. The invasion required specific conditions: low tide to expose German beach obstacles, moonlight for paratroopers, calm seas for landing craft, and low winds for aircraft. These conditions aligned for only a few days each month. In May 1944, Stagg reported to Eisenhower that their forecasting technology had a margin of error that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Stagg himself suffered from stress-induced insomnia, knowing that his imperfect science would determine whether thousands lived or died. The psychological burden on forecasters was profound. They weren't just predicting weather, they were predicting fate. The intelligence challenge was equally daunting. Despite Ultra's breakthrough in cracking Enigma codes, the Allies had huge gaps in knowledge about German beach defenses. Reconnaissance photos showed obstacles, but couldn't reveal mine placement density. Couldn't show how many troops manned each bunker. Couldn't indicate German morale or readiness levels. An intelligence officer named Captain Bruce Wright, who had analyzed thousands of reconnaissance images, admitted in a confidential report that they were making educated guesses about critical defensive positions. He wrote, "We know where the pillboxes are, but we don't know who's inside them, whether they're veterans or terrified teenagers, whether they'll fight to the death or surrender at first opportunity. We're sending 14,000 men against an unknown enemy." This uncertainty gnawed at planners. Every unknown was a potential disaster. Perhaps the most human challenge was maintaining security while preparing such a massive force. By May 1944, southern England had become a vast military camp. 14,000 Canadian soldiers couldn't be hidden. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the buildup. The challenge wasn't hiding the preparations, but misdirecting German interpretation of what they saw. This is where Operation Fortitude, the grand deception scheme, became critical. The plan was to convince German intelligence that the main invasion would target Pas-de-Calais with a massive force under General Patton, while the Normandy landings were merely a diversion. This required exploiting German cultural biases. Nazi intelligence analysts believed in Aryan superiority, which meant they consistently underestimated Allied, especially Commonwealth, capabilities. They believed the Allies would take the most efficient route, the shortest channel crossing to Calais. They believed Patton, whom they respected, would lead the main assault. The deception played into every one of these biases using fake radio traffic, dummy equipment, and double agents. But maintaining the deception meant Canadian troops training for Juno Beach couldn't even know they were the main assault until the last possible moment. Soldiers were told they were Patton's diversion force, that the real invasion would happen elsewhere. This lie, necessary for security, created its own psychological burden. Men wondered if they were being sacrificed as bait. The human cost of this uncertainty was evident in the letters soldiers wrote home. Private Norman Taylor from Montreal wrote to his mother in late May 1944, "They tell us we're just a feint, that the real army will invade elsewhere while we draw German fire. I try to take comfort in that, but Mom, if we're just the distraction, what does that mean for our chances?" This question haunted thousands. The technological failures continued mounting. The weather forecast for early June looked terrible. Stagg predicted storms. Eisenhower had set June 5th as D-Day, but on June 4th, with the invasion fleet already loading, Stagg reported that conditions would be catastrophic. Waves too high, winds too strong, visibility too poor. Eisenhower faced an agonizing decision: postpone and risk German discovery of the fleet sitting in ports. Launch and risk disaster in the storm. He postponed for 24 hours, and on the evening of June 4th, Stagg returned with marginally better news. A brief window of acceptable weather on June 6th. Not good weather, but survivable. Eisenhower made the call. Go. The psychological impact of that 24-hour delay on soldiers waiting in cramped landing craft, seasick, terrified, cannot be overstated. Many had worked themselves into a mental state of readiness on June 5th, only to have that readiness drain away during another day of waiting. Combat psychologists later estimated that the delay increased anxiety-related stress casualties by 30%. Another challenge was coordination between Canadian forces and their British and American allies. Cultural differences in military doctrine created friction. Americans favored aggressive frontal assaults. British preferred methodical advances with overwhelming firepower. Canadians, haunted by Dieppe, wanted something in between. Careful planning with bold execution when opportunities arose. Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey, commanding British Second Army, which included Canadian forces, struggled to reconcile these approaches. In one heated meeting in April 1944, a Canadian brigadier reportedly told Dempsey, "With respect, sir, British caution cost us 3,000 men at Dieppe. We'll advance when it's wise, not when it's tidy. This cultural tension reflected deeper psychological divisions about how to wage war against an enemy as brutal as Nazi Germany. Perhaps the most profound challenge was maintaining morale among troops who had every reason to believe they might die. The Canadian Army had implemented one of the most sophisticated psychological support systems of any military force, including embedded chaplains, medical officers trained in combat stress, and a policy of rotating traumatized soldiers out of frontline service. But these systems had been developed for sustained campaigns, not for a massive amphibious assault where everyone would face maximum danger simultaneously. Captain Frederick Griffin, a chaplain assigned to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, wrote in his journal about the pastoral care challenges he faced. Men came to him not seeking religious comfort, but asking fundamental questions about meaning. Why should they risk everything to liberate people they'd never met? Griffin found himself not preaching scripture, but telling stories about freedom, about how Canadian identity was built on standing against tyranny, about how Vimy Ridge had defined a generation, and Juno Beach would define theirs. This wasn't religious counseling, it was cultural reinforcement, binding individual soldiers to a larger narrative that gave their potential sacrifice meaning. The human cost of doubt and technological failure was epitomized by the Aberdeen bombing disaster in March 1944. During a live-fire training exercise meant to simulate beach assault conditions, coordination failures led to Allied bombers hitting their own forces. 146 soldiers died, most of them Canadian, killed by their own aircraft due to imperfect technology and human error. The incident was classified immediately, but word spread through the ranks. Private James Henderson from Nova Scotia wrote in his diary, "They killed 146 of our boys with friendly fire and covered it up. What else aren't they telling us? How many other ways can this go wrong?" This question became pervasive. Every soldier knew about Aberdeen, even if officially they weren't supposed to. It reinforced the sense that despite all the planning, despite all the technology, they were still vulnerable to chaos and mistakes. Then something shifted. The night of June 5, 1944, as naval convoys began their crossing toward France, a strange calm settled over many of the Canadian soldiers. This wasn't resignation or fatalism. It was something psychologists would later identify as combat flow state, the moment when preparation meets purpose and anxiety transforms into focused determination. Corporal Charles Martin from Toronto later described it in an interview. He said, "I stopped being afraid around midnight. Not because I thought I'd survive, but because I understood that 14,000 of us were in this together. Whatever happened, we weren't dying alone like the boys at Dieppe. We were an army, and that meant something." This cultural bond, this sense of collective purpose, became the invasion's secret weapon. But the Germans manning the Atlantic Wall had no idea any of this was happening. The psychological and technological deception had worked beyond anyone's expectations. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox, the man responsible for coastal defenses, wasn't even in France on June 6th. He'd gone home to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, convinced the weather was too poor for invasion. German weather forecasting technology, inferior to Allied capabilities and further hampered by the Allies' control of Atlantic weather stations, had led German meteorologists to predict sustained storms. Rommel's absence on D-Day would prove catastrophic for German defense, but it also revealed a profound cultural weakness. Nazi command culture discouraged independent decision-making by subordinates. With Rommel gone, German commanders at Normandy would hesitate, would wait for orders that wouldn't come, would fail to coordinate a response because their system relied on top-down control. The Allies, by contrast, had empowered junior officers to adapt and improvise. At 5:30 a.m. on June 6th, the first waves of Canadian troops approached Juno Beach. The sea was rough, waves reaching 4 to 6 feet, making landing craft operators' jobs nearly impossible. Several craft swamped, drowning soldiers before they reached shore. This was exactly the scenario engineers had feared. The DD tanks, the swimming tanks that were supposed to land ahead of infantry and provide covering fire, faced an agonizing decision: launch in rough seas and risk sinking, or land directly on the beach with the infantry, losing the element of surprise. Different units made different choices. The 1st Hussars launched their tanks too far out. 29 tanks entered the water, 19 made it to shore. 10 sank, their crews drowning inside steel coffins. But those 19 tanks that did make it proved invaluable, exactly as hoped. The technological flaw, the canvas flotation screen's vulnerability to rough water, had been partially overcome by human courage and judgment. Some tank commanders chose to launch closer to shore despite orders. Others chose to wait and land conventionally. This flexibility, this human decision-making in the moment, reflected a cultural difference from German rigidity. Meanwhile, the German defenders were experiencing their own technological and psychological crisis. The Atlantic Wall's defenders on Juno Beach were primarily from the 716th Infantry Division, a unit composed largely of older soldiers, conscripts from occupied territories, and soldiers deemed unfit for the Eastern Front. Many were Osttruppen, Soviet prisoners of war who'd been given the choice between starving in POW camps or fighting for Germany. These men had no love for the Nazi cause. Their morale was low, their loyalty questionable. German intelligence had assured them the invasion wouldn't come in this weather, wouldn't come to Normandy at all. When the bombardment began at dawn, when thousands of ships appeared through the mist, many German soldiers simply couldn't process what they were seeing. A German sergeant, Werner Kortenhaus, later testified that his first thought was that this couldn't be real. He said, "I'd been told for months that the invasion would be at Calais, that we were just holding a quiet sector. When I saw the ships, I thought my mind had broken. There were so many I couldn't count them." This psychological shock, this moment of cognitive dissonance, delayed German response by critical minutes. The deception operation had worked so well that even when faced with the reality of the invasion, German defenders initially doubted their own eyes. The Nazi command structure's psychological rigidity became fully apparent in the hours after the landings began. Local commanders called for reinforcements, called for Rommel, called for permission to engage reserves, but Hitler himself had ordered that Panzer reserves couldn't be deployed without his personal approval. And Hitler was asleep. His staff, terrified of waking him, refused to act. By the time Hitler woke around noon and authorized reserve deployment, Canadian forces were already pushing inland. This command paralysis wasn't a technological failure. It was a cultural and psychological failure built into authoritarian systems. No one dared make decisions without approval from above, and the person at the top was inaccessible. The Canadian advance off Juno Beach proved both the power and limitations of human-centered planning. The Regina Rifles and Royal Winnipeg Rifles hit the beach at Courcelles-sur-Mer at H-hour plus 8 minutes, delayed by rough seas. They faced immediate, withering fire from concrete pillboxes. This was the nightmare scenario. Soldiers trapped in the tidal zone, exposed, facing machine guns and artillery. But something unexpected happened. The technological preparation, imperfect as it was, worked just enough. The naval bombardment had damaged, though not destroyed, many German positions. The specialized armor, the Hobart's funnies that had seemed so absurd, proved their worth. Flail tanks cleared paths through minefields. Avard tanks demolished concrete obstacles with massive petard mortars. These weren't wonder weapons. They were tools that gave soldiers just enough edge to survive the critical first minutes. Corporal Gordon Brown of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles later recounted his experience reaching the seawall. He described seeing a German pillbox that should have cut down his entire section. But a Churchill tank firing a petard had blown open the pillbox's firing slit. The defenders inside, stunned by concussion, surrendered immediately. Brown said. I expected to die in that moment. Instead, I was taking prisoners. The whole world had flipped in seconds. This instant transition from existential terror to unexpected success created a psychological momentum. Soldiers who'd expected to die found themselves advancing. This success fed on itself, building confidence, driving the push inland. But the human cost was horrific. The North Shore Regiment, landing at Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, faced the beach's deadliest sector. German defensive positions there had survived bombardment largely intact. The regiment suffered over 35% casualties in the first hour. Private Richard Romer, who would survive to become a decorated pilot and later a judge, watched his platoon torn apart by machine gun fire. He later wrote, "Bodies floated in the surf. Men screamed for medics who were themselves wounded or dead, and yet we kept moving forward. Not because we were brave, but because staying still meant certain death." This grim calculus, this survival instinct overriding fear, pushed Canadians off the beach through sheer desperate momentum. The cultural impact of these first hours would resonate for decades. Canadian units were achieving what British and American forces at other beaches struggled with. By mid-afternoon, Canadian forces had pushed further inland than any other Allied unit on D-Day. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division advanced nearly 9 miles, almost reaching the D-Day objective of Carpiquet Airport, which they wouldn't actually take until July. This rapid advance wasn't due to superior technology or better planning. It was due to the cultural psychology instilled during training. Canadian commanders had emphasized aggressive exploitation of opportunities, learning from Dieppe that hesitation on a fortified beach means death. The human stories emerging from those hours humanized the statistics. Private Leo Major from Montreal single-handedly captured a German communications post, taking 4 prisoners despite being partially blind in one eye from an earlier wound. When his commanding officer suggested he be evacuated, Major refused, saying he'd come to liberate France and intended to do so. This individual determination, replicated across thousands of soldiers, created collective momentum impossible to stop. But the twist in this narrative comes from an unexpected source: the German perspective. Years later, interviews with surviving German defenders revealed that many had been secretly relieved when Canadians captured them. A German soldier named Hans Müller, conscripted from Alsace, admitted in a 1970s interview that when he saw his bunker was about to be overrun, he felt something like relief. He'd been forced to fight for a cause he hated, and capture meant the war was over for him. Müller said, "The Canadians treated us better than our own officers did. They gave us water, cigarettes. I expected execution. Instead, I got humanity." This cultural dimension of the battle, the fact that many German defenders on Juno Beach were reluctant conscripts facing soldiers fighting for a cause they believed in, created a morale differential that technology alone couldn't explain. The afternoon of June 6th brought another revelation about technological imperfection leading to unexpected success. Allied landing schedules had been disrupted by rough seas and German resistance. Units landed in wrong locations, mixed together, lost touch with their headquarters. By conventional military doctrine, this chaos should have been catastrophic. But the cultural training emphasizing initiative and adaptation meant Canadian junior officers simply regrouped whoever they found and continued advancing. Lieutenant Bill Miner found himself commanding a mixed force of soldiers from 3 different regiments, none of whom were supposed to be together. Rather than wait for orders or try to sort out the confusion, he advanced toward the sound of gunfire. His impromptu battle group captured the village of Grès-sur-Mer by evening. This cultural flexibility, this ability to function despite broken communication and mixed units, contrasted sharply with German rigidity. When German units lost contact with headquarters, they often froze, awaiting orders. Canadian forces kept moving. The psychological warfare aspect reached its peak as word spread among German defenders that the invasion was real, massive, and succeeding. Rommel, racing back from Germany, couldn't reach Normandy until late evening. By then, Allied forces held the beaches. German commanders who'd expected to throw the invasion back into the sea faced the reality that they'd been deceived about everything: the invasion location, timing, strength, and Allied capabilities. This cognitive shock, this realization that everything they'd been told was wrong, shattered German defensive morale. A German regimental commander, Colonel Wilhelm Richter, surrendered his remaining forces on June 7th with a statement that revealed the psychological dimension of defeat. He reportedly said, "We were told the Allies couldn't coordinate such an operation, couldn't maintain secrecy, couldn't overcome our defenses. Every assumption was false. How do we fight an enemy when our intelligence is fiction?" This question encapsulated the success of Allied psychological warfare. The deception hadn't just hidden the invasion, it had convinced German forces their defensive superiority was unquestionable. When that belief shattered, it took their will to fight with it. The immediate aftermath of Juno Beach's success revealed both the battle's profound impact and its human costs in ways that would reshape post-war Canadian identity and global military doctrine. By June 12th, exactly 1 week after the landing, Canadian forces had linked up with British forces from Gold Beach and begun pushing toward Caen. The cost had been brutal: 1,074 Canadian casualties on D-Day alone, including 359 dead. This was far fewer than Dieppe's catastrophe, but each death represented a family destroyed, a community mourning, a future erased. The psychological impact on survivors was complex and would take decades to fully manifest. Many soldiers experienced what we now recognize as survivor's guilt mixed with pride. Private George Blackburn, an artillery officer, wrote in his journal on June 8th about watching comrades being buried in temporary graves. He wrote, "We succeeded where Dieppe failed, but I can't celebrate when Tommy's body is in the ground and I'm alive, only because a shell landed 3 feet to my left instead of 3 feet to my right. What did I do differently than him? Nothing. I'm alive by chance, not merit." This randomness of survival, this understanding that survival wasn't earned but granted by blind luck, haunted many veterans. The technological lessons learned from Juno Beach would revolutionize amphibious warfare. The DD tanks, despite their flaws and losses, proved the concept of amphibious armor. Post-war analysis showed that beaches where DD tanks successfully landed had 50% lower casualties than beaches where tanks landed conventionally or failed to land at all. This statistical validation led to decades of development in amphibious warfare technology. The American Marine Corps, observing Canadian success, adopted similar specialized armor for Pacific operations and later for the Incheon landing in Korea. The cultural impact on Canada was immediate and profound. News of Juno Beach's success reached Canadian newspapers on June 7th. After years of war, after Dieppe's trauma, Canadians finally had a clear, undeniable victory. The psychological effect on home front morale was tremendous. War bond sales surged. Volunteering increased. More importantly, a sense of Canadian military competence, of Canadian ability to achieve what others couldn't, solidified into national identity. Historian Pierre Berton later wrote that Juno Beach did for World War II what Vimy Ridge had done for World War I. It gave Canadians proof they could excel militarily on the world stage. But this cultural pride came with shadows. The French-Canadian relationship to Juno Beach was complicated. While many French Canadians served with distinction, including the Régiment de la Chaudière, which landed at Bernières-sur-Mer, Quebec's relationship with the war remained fraught. Conscription remained controversial, with many French Canadians viewing the war as an English-Canadian and British cause. The success at Juno Beach couldn't erase these cultural tensions, though it did complicate them. Some French-Canadian veterans found themselves honored in English Canada while remaining controversial in Quebec, caught between competing cultural narratives about what the war meant. The liberation of French villages brought its own psychological and cultural complexities. Norman French civilians who'd lived under occupation for 4 years initially greeted Canadian liberators with overwhelming joy. But this joy was complicated by 4 years of trauma, collaboration, resistance, and survival. Canadian soldiers, many of whom had romanticized France as a culture to be saved, encountered the messy reality of occupied populations, where some had collaborated, some had resisted, and most had simply tried to survive. Private Jacques Dextraz, a French-Canadian soldier, later recalled entering the village of Benny-sur-Mer and being embraced by crying French civilians. But he also recalled the tension when villagers pointed out collaborators to be punished. He said, "We came as liberators, but liberation meant judgments, retribution, scores settled. I thought freedom would be simple joy. Instead, it was complicated, human, messy." This realization that war's moral clarity disappeared in occupied territories' gray zones challenged many soldiers' psychological frameworks. The technological innovations proved by Juno Beach had global implications. The specialized armor, the coordination of naval bombardment with aerial support and ground assault, the amphibious logistics, all became templates for future operations. The American landing at Okinawa in 1945 used lessons learned from Normandy. The Israeli Defense Forces, decades later, would study Juno Beach when developing their own amphibious capabilities. The ripple effects of those innovations spread through military doctrine worldwide, but perhaps the most significant long-term impact was psychological and cultural. Juno Beach proved that highly trained, motivated soldiers with imperfect but adaptable technology could overcome theoretically impregnable defenses when they believed in their cause and trusted their leaders. This lesson influenced military training for generations. The emphasis shifted from viewing soldiers as interchangeable parts in a machine to viewing them as adaptive human beings whose initiative and cultural cohesion were force multipliers. The Canadian military's post-war emphasis on small unit leadership, on empowering junior officers, on cultural cohesion within units, all derived from Juno Beach's lessons. The personal toll on liberators became apparent in the weeks after D-Day as Canadian forces fought through Normandy toward Caen. The hedgerows, the medieval stone villages, the farm-by-farm fighting proved psychologically devastating. Many soldiers who'd survived Juno Beach's intense horror found the sustained combat of the Normandy campaign even more destructive to their mental health. Combat psychiatrists attached to Canadian forces reported that rates of combat fatigue, what we now call PTSD, increased through June and July despite soldiers being veterans of D-Day. Dr. Fred Van Nostrand, a psychiatrist treating soldiers near Caen, noted in his reports that soldiers could maintain psychological cohesion through acute crises like beach landings, but sustained combat with daily losses eroded morale differently. He wrote, "They stormed a fortress beach and succeeded, but the daily grind of watching friends die in nameless villages, of killing teenage German soldiers, conscripts who looked terrified, this wears away at their souls in ways the dramatic battle didn't." This observation challenged assumptions about combat stress and led to post-war changes in how militaries managed troop rotations. The cultural symbolism of Juno Beach began crystallizing even before the war ended. Canadian war correspondents like Ross Munro, who had covered Dieppe and Juno Beach, wrote dispatches comparing the two battles that entered Canadian cultural consciousness. Munro's famous line, "At Dieppe we learned what not to do. At Juno Beach, we did everything right," simplified complex realities but created a powerful narrative. This narrative served important psychological purposes for a nation that needed to believe its sacrifices meant something, that progress was possible, that Dieppe's deaths had led to Juno Beach's success and therefore weren't meaningless. The German perspective on Juno Beach evolved over decades. Immediately after the war, German military analysts focused on tactical failures, on why their vaunted Atlantic Wall had crumbled. But as more testimonies emerged, as more German soldiers spoke candidly, a different picture emerged. Many German defenders hadn't been committed Nazis. They'd been ordinary men caught in a totalitarian system, and when given the chance to surrender to soldiers who treated prisoners humanely, they took it. This humanization of the enemy complicated simplistic good versus evil narratives, but added depth to understanding why the Atlantic Wall failed. It wasn't just technology or tactics. It was the difference between soldiers fighting for a cause they believed in versus soldiers fighting for a regime they feared or hated. One particularly poignant story emerged years later from Hans Schmidt, a German soldier who'd been positioned in a bunker at Courseulles-sur-Mer. Schmidt had been a teacher before the war, conscripted in 1943, and assigned to a defensive position he knew was doomed. On June 6th, as Canadian forces overran his position, Schmidt made a split-second decision. He'd hidden his unit's codebook rather than destroy it, then surrendered immediately. He later admitted he'd done this hoping his cooperation might earn him decent treatment. It did. Schmidt spent the rest of the war in a Canadian POW camp in Ontario, where he was allowed to teach German to Canadian intelligence officers. He said in a 1980s interview, "I betrayed nothing that mattered to me because Nazi Germany wasn't my country, but I helped Canada. And in return, they treated me as a human being. That small act of humanity in the middle of war meant more to me than any ideology." Stories like Schmidt's revealed that Juno Beach's success wasn't just about defeating the enemy, but about maintaining humanity while doing so. The technological legacy extended beyond military applications. Canadian engineers who'd worked on amphibious vehicles and landing craft returned home and applied their expertise to civilian transportation. The ferry systems in British Columbia and across Canada's coasts benefited from innovations developed for Juno Beach. More broadly, the system's engineering approach required for coordinating such a complex operation influenced post-war infrastructure projects. The St. Lawrence Seaway, completed in 1959, used project management techniques developed during Overlord planning. War technology becoming peacetime progress became a theme of post-war Canadian development. The psychological research conducted on combat stress during the Normandy campaign led to the founding of Canada's military psychology services. The understanding that soldiers needed psychological support as much as physical medical care, that mental wounds were real and required treatment, revolutionized military medicine. This research eventually influenced civilian psychology as well, particularly in understanding trauma and developing therapeutic approaches. The cultural bonds forged during Juno Beach preparations and the battle itself created a network of veterans who remained connected for life. Regiment reunions became annual events where aging soldiers shared memories, processed trauma collectively, and found meaning in their shared experience. These reunions served therapeutic purposes, allowing veterans to speak truths they couldn't share with civilians who hadn't experienced combat. Sociologists studying these veteran communities noted that they created their own cultural identity, separate from both civilian society and active military culture, a liminal space where the horrors and glories of war could coexist without judgment. The liberation of France created lasting cultural ties between Canada and Normandy specifically. Towns like Courseulles-sur-Mer, Bernières-sur-Mer, and Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer adopted Canadian regiments. Schools were named after Canadian units. Canadian flags flew alongside French flags. This ongoing cultural relationship, maintained through decades, represented war's rare positive legacy, genuine friendship built on shared sacrifice. Norman families who'd been liberated by Canadians passed down stories to children and grandchildren, keeping the memory alive. Canadian veterans who returned to Normandy for anniversary commemorations were welcomed as heroes and friends. This transatlantic cultural bond, forged in blood and maintained through decades of friendship, humanized abstract concepts like liberation and alliance. By the time of Juno Beach's 50th anniversary in 1994, most survivors were in their 70s, facing mortality, urgently wanting to share their stories before time ran out. Oral history projects conducted in the 1990s captured thousands of testimonies, revealing details that official histories had missed. These personal accounts emphasize the human dimension, the fear, the luck, the bonds of friendship, the moral ambiguity, the pride mixed with sorrow. Historian John Keegan, reviewing these testimonies, noted that they painted a far more complex picture than the triumphalist narratives of immediate post-war years. Juno Beach wasn't a clean victory. It was a bloody, chaotic, terrifying experience that succeeded not because everything went right, but because soldiers adapted when things went wrong, because cultural cohesion held under unimaginable stress, because human initiative overcame technological limitations. The environmental legacy of Juno Beach and the Normandy campaign remained visible for decades. The Norman landscape was scarred by bombs, shells, and wreckage. Farmers plowing fields into the 21st century still occasionally unearth unexploded ordnance, requiring careful disposal. This physical reminder that war's impacts last generations became part of Norman cultural identity. The Juno Beach Center, a Canadian museum opened in 2003 at Courseulles-sur-Mer, serves as a pilgrimage site for Canadians seeking to understand their history. The museum's design, focusing on personal stories rather than just military hardware, reflects modern understanding that war's meaning lies in human experience, not technological achievement. The cultural impact on Indigenous Canadians who served at Juno Beach deserves specific mention. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit soldiers served with distinction, though their contributions were often overlooked in mainstream narratives. Soldiers like Tommy Prince, who went on to serve in the Devil's Brigade and became one of Canada's most decorated Indigenous soldiers, fought not just for Canada, but for recognition of Indigenous peoples' place in Canadian society. Their service complicated relationships with a nation that had historically marginalized them. Post-war, some Indigenous veterans leveraged their service to demand rights and recognition, contributing to the eventual evolution toward Indigenous rights movements in subsequent decades. The psychological complexity of fighting for a country that discriminated against you while proving your worth through military service created its own trauma, one that would take generations to address. The true resolution of Juno Beach's story isn't found in military after-action reports or casualty statistics, but in how it transformed individuals and cultures in ways that rippled forward through generations. Lieutenant Commander James Reynolds, whom we met at the beginning standing on the deck watching the coast emerge, survived the war and returned to Canada in 1945. He never spoke publicly about Juno Beach during his lifetime, though his family found journals after his death in 1987. In these private writings, Reynolds reflected on what the operation meant to him personally. He wrote about the impossible burden of command, knowing that his decisions would result in deaths. He wrote about survivors' guilt so profound, he sometimes wished he'd died instead of the young soldiers under his command. But he also wrote about pride, not in the military sense, but in the human sense. Pride that ordinary people had faced extraordinary evil and prevailed. Pride that the flawed plans, imperfect technology, and terrified young men had somehow achieved what seemed impossible. His final journal entry, written weeks before his death, read simply, "We were all so frightened. That's what they never tell you. The heroes were terrified. We advance despite fear, not without it. And perhaps that's the real lesson. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's taking the next step forward while your whole body screams to run away." The soldiers who fought at Juno Beach returned home to a Canada that was simultaneously proud of them and unable to understand what they'd experienced. The gap between civilian understanding and veteran reality created isolation. Many veterans struggled with PTSD before it had a name, self-medicating with alcohol, unable to hold jobs, relationships fractured by trauma they couldn't articulate. The Canadian Legion halls that sprang up in every town became safe spaces where veterans could gather with the only people who truly understood. These halls served as informal therapy groups, though no one called them that. The cultural impact extended to literature and art. Canadian writers who'd served, like Farley Mowat, who fought through the Italian campaign, brought their experiences into novels that tried to capture war's reality beyond patriotic mythology. Mowat's work, and that of others like Pierre Berton, who documented Canadian military history, created a uniquely Canadian war literature that emphasized sacrifice without glorification, valor without jingoism. This cultural production helped Canadians process what the war had cost and what it had achieved. The women who'd served in supporting roles, like the WAFs who'd operated radar systems, the nurses who'd treated casualties, the factory workers who'd built landing craft, found themselves written out of many official histories. Only in recent decades have historians begun recovering these stories, recognizing that Juno Beach's success depended on thousands of women whose contributions were minimized or forgotten. Reconstruction of these narratives has been culturally important, expanding understanding of who contributed to the war effort and what forms service took. The technological innovations pioneered for Juno Beach influenced Canadian industrial development for decades. The engineering firms that had built specialized landing craft and amphibious vehicles pivoted to civilian marine industries. The coordination and logistics expertise developed. Planning the invasion influenced everything from Trans-Canada highway construction to telecommunications network development. War mobilization had forced rapid innovation and industrialization that Canada maintained into the post-war boom. This technological legacy, less dramatic than the battle itself, arguably had more lasting impact on Canadian society. The psychological research on combat stress conducted during and after the Normandy campaign contributed to broader understanding of trauma. Canadian psychiatrists who'd treated combat fatigue published studies that influenced civilian trauma treatment. The recognition that extreme stress could break anyone, that psychological wounds were real and required treatment, gradually permeated beyond military medicine into general health care. This shift in understanding trauma had implications for how society viewed mental health generally, contributing to slow destigmatization of psychological treatment. The cultural memory of Juno Beach evolved over decades. Immediately post-war, the narrative was triumphalist. Canada's great victory, the day we proved our military excellence. By the 1960s and 70s, as veterans began speaking more candidly and anti-war sentiment grew during the Vietnam era, narratives became more complex. The horror and cost received more emphasis alongside the achievement. By the 1990s and 2000s, as the greatest generation aged and began dying, a rush to memorialize and preserve their stories emerged. The Juno Beach Center Museum project, funded by Canadian donations and opened in 2003, represented this cultural desire to honor veterans before they were all gone. The changing memory of Juno Beach reflects broader cultural shifts in how societies remember war. The Norman communities liberated by Canadians maintained their cultural connection remarkably well. The mayor of Courseulles-sur-Mer, Brigitte Lebrun, said in a 2004 interview that her town's identity was inseparable from June 6, 1944. She grew up hearing stories from her grandmother about the liberation, about Canadian soldiers sharing chocolate with children, about the fear of German occupation ending. She said, "We owe our freedom to young men who crossed an ocean to fight for people they'd never met. How do you repay that debt? You remember, you honor, you never forget." This cultural memory in Normandy, passed generationally, stands as perhaps the most human legacy of Juno Beach. The emotional connection between Norman communities and Canada remained strong into the 21st century. The German perspective on Juno Beach's legacy is complicated but illuminating. Post-war Germany struggled with how to remember World War II when they'd been the aggressors. For German soldiers who'd fought at Juno Beach, their experience didn't fit simplistic narratives. Most hadn't been committed Nazis. Most had been conscripts who'd done what survival required. When German veterans eventually began sharing their stories, often decades after the war, they described Juno Beach as the day they realized Germany would lose, the day the Atlantic Wall's myth of impregnability shattered. Some expressed relief. Hans Joachim Röhl, who'd been a young lieutenant,